I thought moving into my dream neighborhood would finally bring peace. But I was wrong. Karen, the HOA president, fined me $1,000. Yes, $1,000, for something I didn't even do. And she wasn't done. She kept threatening me with more fines, trying to force me out of my own home. I felt trapped, angry, and powerless, until I realized there was a way to turn the tables. What I did next shocked everyone, not just Karen. The whole neighborhood couldn't believe it. You're about to see how I exposed her lies, got my revenge, and finally took back control. Trust me, this isn't your typical HOA story. I thought moving into my new home would be the start of something peaceful. I had spent months looking for the perfect house. Quiet streets, neat lawns, and neighbors who waved when you walked by. This was everything I had imagined. When I finally got the keys, I couldn't stop smiling. I unpacked my things, set up my little garden, and even picked out flowers for the front yard. I felt like I had finally arrived somewhere I could belong. But I quickly realized, living in a neighborhood controlled by an HOA wasn't exactly the paradise I had imagined. At first, I thought the rules were just basic guidelines. Trim your bushes. Keep the lawn tidy. Don't park on the street overnight. That seemed fair. And for a while, everything was fine. But then, Karen showed up. Karen was the HOA president. From the first time I met her, I felt something was off. She had this way of smiling that didn't reach her eyes, and her tone was always just a little too sharp. She came over one morning to introduce herself. I tried to be polite. I said, "Hi, I'm glad to be here. I'm looking forward to being part of the community." She nodded and said, "Yes, we'll see how that goes." I remember feeling a little uncomfortable, but I brushed it off. Maybe I was just reading too much into it. A few weeks after moving in, I got my first notice. It was an HOA fine. $200. For my mailbox. Apparently, the mailbox didn't match neighborhood standards. I had no idea what that meant. I checked the HOA rules. My mailbox looked exactly like the examples in the guideline brochure. I tried to appeal. I sent emails, took pictures, and explained politely that my mailbox was compliant. The response was short. "The fine stands." I shrugged it off. Okay, maybe a small mistake, I thought. I paid it. But then the fines kept coming. $50 for a crooked flower pot. $100 for leaving my trash can out one evening. $75 for a crack in the driveway. Every time, it felt like Karen was watching me, waiting for a reason to punish me. Other neighbors were breaking rules left and right. Dogs off leash, lawns unkempt, cars parked all over the place, but Karen never fined them. Just me. And I wasn't imagining it. The pattern was clear. One evening, I was watering my garden when Karen appeared again. She was walking down the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, scanning every yard. She stopped at mine, squinted at my flowers, and muttered something about careless landscaping. Then she wrote something on her clipboard and left. I felt my chest tighten. I couldn't believe this. I had never felt so micromanaged in my life. Things escalated quickly after that. Karen seemed to have a personal vendetta. Every minor thing was turned into a rule violation. My neighbor had a tiny crack in their driveway that went unmentioned. My other neighbor had a mailbox that was painted a slightly darker shade than the rules allowed. But Karen only came after me. I started keeping a notebook, recording every interaction. I saved emails, took photos of my lawn, and wrote down every fine. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. Then came the biggest shock of all. One Monday morning, I opened the mailbox and found a letter with a bright red stamp at the top. $1,000 fine. My stomach dropped. I read the details. Karen had fined me for repeated violations and failure to comply with HOA standards. I was in disbelief. I hadn't done anything illegal or dangerous. I hadn't ignored any notices. And now, out of nowhere, I owed $1,000. I remember sitting on my porch for what felt like hours, staring at that letter. My hands were shaking. I felt a mix of anger, fear, and frustration. How could someone have that much power over me? I owned my house. I paid my mortgage. And yet, Karen, one person, in a little office in a HOA building, was dictating what I could and couldn't do in my own yard. It felt surreal. I thought about leaving a polite note or just paying it. But deep down, I knew something had to change. I couldn't just let her control me. Not like this. I started talking to neighbors. Some of them had quietly suffered under Karen's rules for years. One woman told me she had been fined for putting a wreath on her door during the holidays. Another man had a $500 fine for painting his front door a color that wasn't approved, even though the HOA brochure explicitly allowed it. They all warned me, Karen doesn't back down. She targets people who push back. At this point, I realized I was in over my head if I didn't act carefully. I needed to understand the rules, document everything, and find a way to protect myself. But more than that, I wanted to show Karen that she couldn't treat me like this. I wanted justice. And I knew that if I planned carefully, I could turn this situation around. The feeling of being watched, judged, and controlled was suffocating. Every time I walked outside, I felt like Karen's eyes were on me. Every sound of a car door slamming or a neighbor talking felt like a potential complaint. It wasn't just about the fines anymore, it was about control, power, and humiliation. And I couldn't let her win. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the $1,000 fine and all the notes I had been keeping. I realized that if I wanted to protect myself, and maybe even teach Karen a lesson, I had to be smart. I couldn't let anger drive me. I had to let strategy guide me. That's when the first seeds of a plan started to form. A plan that would shock the neighborhood, and more importantly, shock Karen herself. I didn't know exactly how I would do it yet. But I knew one thing, this wasn't going to end quietly. I wasn't going to pay the fine without a fight. I wasn't going to let Karen humiliate me in my own home. And little did she know, the next few weeks would change everything. After receiving that $1,000 fine, I thought things might calm down if I tried to keep my yard and mailbox perfectly in line with the HOA rules. I was careful, meticulous even. Every morning, I checked the lawn, the mailbox, my driveway, and even my porch decorations. I made sure nothing could possibly be seen as a violation. I thought maybe Karen would leave me alone if she couldn't find a reason to complain. But I was wrong. Within a week, I got another letter. This one was even worse. Karen had written that I was neglecting curb appeal, and now I owed another $500. I couldn't understand it. I had trimmed the bushes, planted fresh flowers, and cleaned the driveway. I reread the HOA handbook and even double-checked every guideline. I hadn't broken any rules. Nothing. I called the HOA office to ask for clarification. I was polite, calm, trying to remain professional. I said, I believe I've followed all the guidelines. Could you please explain the basis for this fine? The receptionist hesitated, then muttered something about board discretion, and hung up. I realized then that there was no logic. Karen had absolute power, and she was using it. The next week, Karen appeared at my doorstep. I was watering my small vegetable garden when I heard her stern voice behind me, "Your lawn is uneven. Those weeds near the fence are unacceptable. And your mailbox, again." I froze. I had just spent an hour fixing every inch of that yard. I just trimmed everything, I said softly, trying not to let my voice shake. She gave me that same thin-lipped smile. You know the rules, she said. This is your final warning. Next time, the fines will double. Her words hit me like a punch to the chest. I felt trapped. Every day, I walked outside wondering if I would get a note in my mailbox, another fine in the mail, another threat. I couldn't enjoy my home anymore. What had been a place of peace was now a source of stress, anxiety, and sleepless nights. I started talking to more neighbors. Some were sympathetic. Others had learned to keep quiet. But one neighbor, Mrs. Harlan, shared something interesting. She said, "Karen, she's not just enforcing the rules. She's picking targets. If she doesn't like you, you're doomed." I thought about that for days. Was I just unlucky? Or was Karen deliberately harassing me? The more I reflected, the more I realized it wasn't luck, it was personal. And if it was personal, that meant I had to be careful. But it also meant I could fight back. I began keeping a detailed log of every interaction with Karen. I took pictures of my yard weekly. I recorded dates and times of visits, letters, fines, and phone calls. I even started discreetly filming some encounters. I wasn't breaking any laws. I was protecting myself. But the idea of using evidence to confront her, well, that idea started to grow in my mind. Then came the real test. One afternoon, I returned home from work to find Karen parked in front of my house. She was taking photos of my driveway and writing notes furiously. I approached her, trying to stay calm. "Is there a problem?" I asked. She looked up, annoyed. "You're not following the community standards. This is unacceptable." I felt my blood boil. I knew she couldn't prove anything. I had meticulously followed the rules. "Can you show me where I'm in violation?" I asked. She snapped back. "I don't have to. I am the HOA president, and this is my discretion." That's when it hit me. She was abusing her power. And it wasn't just me, she had been doing this to others for years. I needed a strategy. I couldn't just complain to the board. They were her allies. I couldn't call the police, there was nothing illegal yet. But I could document everything. I could expose her. Over the next few days, I spent hours going through HOA meeting notes, board emails, and community guidelines. I compared them to Karen's actions. I found dozens of inconsistencies. Rules she claimed existed didn't. Fines she issued were arbitrary. Complaints she dismissed for others were suddenly targeted at me. I realized I had the tools to prove she was unfair. I just had to be smart. At the same time, Karen's harassment escalated. She sent me letters threatening eviction. She claimed my yard was hazardous, even though it was perfectly maintained. She accused me of disrupting the neighborhood aesthetic. One letter arrived with a tone so condescending, I felt my anger rising. Every time she tried to push me out, I felt more determined to fight back. But I had to wait. I couldn't rush. I had to plan. I needed to gather solid evidence, and I had to make sure the entire neighborhood would see the truth. I thought about what Mrs. Harlan had said. Karen picks her targets. She loves control. And she thrives on fear. If I could remove fear from the equation, maybe I could finally take the power back. I started small. I wrote clear, polite emails responding to each fine. I attached photos, quotes from the HOA handbook, and timelines. I asked for clarification in writing. Karen didn't respond most of the time. When she did, she got defensive, rude, and sometimes threatened more fines. Then came the turning point, something I hadn't anticipated. I discovered that Karen was secretly bending HOA rules for her friends. Some neighbors had clearly violated the rules multiple times. Loud parties, paint colors, fences, landscaping, but Karen let them slide. I began to realize she wasn't just strict, she was biased. She used the rules as a weapon against people she disliked. This was the moment I decided, I wouldn't let her control me anymore. I would fight back. But I didn't want to fight in anger. I wanted to fight smart. I started crafting a plan that would expose her for the manipulative, unfair person she truly was. And I knew that if I did it right, the neighborhood itself would see it. I won't lie, it felt risky. Karen had authority. She had influence. But I had something she didn't, truth and evidence. And the longer she continued, the more mistakes she made. Every fine, every arbitrary complaint, every threat she sent only added fuel to my strategy. I began preparing. I gathered every document, every photo, every email. I created a folder for each incident. I mapped out every rule she claimed I broke and compared it to the HOA guidelines. I even quietly recorded a few interactions where she admitted things that contradicted the handbook. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. I realized that Karen's power was only as strong as her secrecy. If I could show people what was really happening, her power would vanish. And that's when the first real idea of revenge came to me. Not a mean prank, not a legal retaliation, but a way to expose her hypocrisy in a way that would shock the neighborhood and make her regret ever targeting me. The next steps were delicate. I couldn't rush. Every move had to be calculated. But one thing was certain: Karen had underestimated me. And by the end of this, she would learn that some homeowners are not to be messed with. The moment I realized Karen wasn't just strict but biased, everything changed. Before that, I felt powerless. Like she held all the cards. But now, I understood something important. People like Karen only stay in control because no one challenges them. Everyone was scared. Everyone was tired. But nobody had taken the time to gather proof. And that was my advantage. I didn't want chaos. I didn't want to break rules or start a war. What I wanted was fairness. Respect. And honestly, I wanted Karen to finally face the consequences of how she treated people. I knew it wouldn't happen overnight, but I could feel the beginning of something shifting inside me, this steady determination that I refused to ignore. So I started putting my plan together. It began with information. Real, solid, undeniable information. I spent evenings going through the HOA handbook, highlighting sections and noting rule inconsistencies. I compared every fine notice Karen sent me against the written guidelines. I kept finding things that didn't match. She was making up new rules that didn't exist anywhere. She was doubling fines without approval. And she was enforcing standards on me that she completely ignored for her friends. I knew that alone wouldn't be enough. I needed witnesses. But I had to be careful. I didn't know who I could trust. Some neighbors were friendly but scared of speaking out. Others were friendly with Karen and would probably run straight to her if I said anything. And I wasn't ready for her to know I was preparing something. So I started small. I talked to people casually, never mentioning Karen by name. I'd ask things like, "Hey, have you ever had issues with fines around here?" Or, "Do you know how strict the HOA usually is?" You'd be surprised how quickly people talk when they feel they're not alone. I learned that an older couple down the street had been fined for having a small shed in their backyard, even though the shed was already there when they moved in. Another man told me Karen walked into his yard without permission, claiming she needed to inspect for rule violations. And then there was Mrs. Harlan, who had been fined for something as small as leaving a fall-themed doormat on her porch. One story stood out, though. A neighbor named Lucas had been fined almost $700 in a single month. When he complained, Karen told him if he kept challenging her, she would escalate it. He eventually paid because he didn't want trouble. Hearing that made my stomach twist. It was the same pattern she used with me. Threaten. Intimidate. Push until people gave up. But Lucas told me something else. Something important. He said, "If anyone ever tried to take her down, I'd help. I'm tired of being scared of her." That sentence stayed with me. I didn't want to take her down in some dramatic or destructive way, but exposing her? Bringing her actions into the light? Making the board and neighbors see what she'd really been doing? Yes. That was the direction I was heading. So I asked Lucas if he still had his notices. He did. He had kept all of them. When I compared his fines with mine, the pattern became unavoidable. Karen had created her own set of unofficial rules. Rules she selectively applied. Rules she used to intimidate homeowners she didn't like. I made a folder called Pattern of Abuse. Everything went into it: emails, photos, HOA guidelines, neighbors' fines, timestamps. Every detail mattered. If I wanted to stand a chance, I needed this to be airtight. Then, Something happened that pushed my plan from preparation into action. One Friday evening, I came home from a long day at work, tired and hoping for a quiet night. But as soon as I turned into my driveway, I saw it. Another paper taped to my front door. Another fine. This one for excessive noise. The fine was $350. I stood there, staring at the paper, confused. Excessive noise? I hadn't even been home that day. My house was quiet. My neighbors had been quiet. I hadn't played music or hosted anyone. Nothing. It was fabricated. Completely made up. And something inside me snapped, not with anger, but with clarity. Karen had crossed the line into pure harassment. She wasn't even pretending anymore. She was just stacking fines, hoping I'd break, hoping I'd move, hoping I'd disappear. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the fine for a long time. And then, for the first time, I said out loud, "She's not going to get away with this." I knew exactly what I needed to do next. I wasn't going to argue with her directly anymore. I wasn't going to beg the board for help. They were all under Karen's influence. Instead, I needed something that would force transparency. Something that would make the HOA legally accountable. Something Karen couldn't control. That's when I remembered something from Lucas' story. He mentioned he once asked to see financial records but was denied. He didn't know his rights. But I did. Under state HOA laws, every homeowner has the right to request full financial transparency, board meeting records, rule approval documents, and complaint files. And they legally have to provide them. I wasn't sure what I'd find, but I had a feeling Karen wasn't just abusing rules. She might be manipulating finances or hiding complaints. If she denied my request or delayed it, that alone would be suspicious. If she complied, well, then I'd get access to everything she'd been hiding. So the next morning, professionally and politely, I emailed a formal request for the last 3 years of HOA financial statements, records of fine approvals, documentation for rule changes, logs of homeowner complaints, notices sent to all residents. I kept my tone neutral. No anger. No accusation. Just a simple, calm request. I sent it at 9:12 a.m. At 9:16 a.m., Karen replied. Her message was short, defensive, and honestly, a little panicked. Your request is unnecessary and disruptive. The board will review it at a later date if needed. Stop creating issues. There it was, the mistake I was waiting for. She couldn't deny my request legally. And now she had sent written proof that she was blocking access to required documents. I saved that email immediately. That wasn't the only mistake she made that week. A few days later, Karen came to my door with another notice. But this time, she didn't know my audio recorder was running in my pocket. She said several things that contradicted the HOA rules, things that made it clear she was targeting me personally. "You've been a problem," she said. "If you don't comply, we'll escalate this further." I kept my voice calm and asked, "Which rule have I violated?" She paused. She looked irritated. And then she said the one sentence I needed, "That doesn't matter. I decide the rules." I swear I felt my heart stop. I knew this was it. This was the evidence that tied everything together. I didn't show any reaction. I just nodded, thanked her for coming by, and closed the door. Then I sat down and replayed the audio. Hearing those words again made my skin crawl, but it also filled me with a new kind of confidence. Karen wasn't just careless. She was reckless. And she had no idea I was collecting everything. For the first time in a long time, I slept peacefully that night. Because now, I had what I needed. The foundation of my plan was ready. I was done being silent. And Karen had no idea what was coming. I woke up the next morning with a strange kind of calm sitting in my chest. It wasn't peace. And it wasn't confidence. It was something else. Something heavier. Like the moment before a storm breaks the sky open. You feel it. You just don't know what part is going to hit you first. I stood in my kitchen, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, staring out the window. My yard looked normal. Too normal. And that normalness made me uneasy. Because I knew Karen wasn't done. Not even close. People like her don't quit. They escalate. They push until someone breaks. But the thing she never understood. I wasn't the one who was going to break. Right around 10 a.m., I heard the sound. A car door. A second one. Then voices. Sharp ones. The kind that don't belong to neighbors. The kind that belong to people showing up on official business. I stepped out onto my porch just as two police officers approached the walkway. Behind them, walking a few steps back, was Karen, arms crossed, chin up, smug look plastered across her face like she had already won whatever fight she thought this was. I didn't even flinch. Not this time. The older officer in front gave me a polite nod. Morning. We received a report from the HOA president regarding threats and harassment. I almost laughed. Almost. Of course you did, I said calmly. You're welcome to look around, ask anything you need. I've got nothing to hide. Karen stepped forward like she couldn't help herself. She's been intimidating board members, refusing compliance, and she threatened me personally yesterday. I want her fined, and I want a restraining order filed. The officer turned to her, brows lightly raised. Ma'am, that's not how restraining orders work. That alone could have been enough to make my day, but I stayed quiet. This wasn't the moment to grin. Not yet. The officers asked to talk to me privately, and I invited them inside. I showed them the binder, the timestamps, the recordings, the notes, the emails, the photos, every carefully documented piece of harassment. And I watched their faces change. The younger officer glanced toward the window, where Karen waited on my lawn like a queen inspecting her land. Ma'am, he said, I'm gonna be honest, this looks more like you're the one being targeted. I nodded. Yes. That's why I've been gathering everything. I knew one day she'd try to twist the narrative. The older officer leaned back slightly, arms crossing. Did you threaten her? No, I said. But I told her I wouldn't be bullied anymore. And I told her that whatever she was hiding, it wouldn't stay hidden forever. That's not a threat. That's just truth. He looked down at the binder again. Yeah, I see why you said it. When they stepped outside to speak with her, I stayed by the door. I didn't hide. And I didn't pretend I wasn't listening. Karen's voice hit the air first. Well, are you giving her a citation? She clearly lied. She's been aggressive. The older officer cut in. Ma'am, we reviewed what she showed us. There's no evidence she's harassing you. In fact, we're seeing quite a bit that points the other way. There was a pause. A real one. One where you could practically hear Karen's brain scrambling for a new angle. That's not possible, she said sharply. She's manipulating you. You don't understand the bigger picture here. The officer's tone shifted. Ma'am, unless you have actual evidence, not just your suspicions, there's nothing here to pursue. And I'd strongly advise you to stop filing complaints that aren't legitimate. That word. Illegitimate. It hit her like a slap. I could see it from where I stood. Her face tensed. Her mouth tightened. But still, she didn't back off. I want the full board notified, she snapped. We'll deal with her through HOA channels. And I'll be filing an escalation against you too, as well if you refuse to do your jobs. There it was. Her nuclear button. Her favorite threat. Her default when she couldn't control the narrative. Destroy everyone in the path. But this time, it didn't work. The older officer didn't argue. Didn't raise his voice. He just nodded professionally. Ma'am, you can file whatever you'd like. But our part here is done. And with that, the officers walked back to their car. Karen stayed. In my yard. Staring at me like I had personally ruined her entire life. She marched up to my steps, close enough to look intimidating, far enough to stay out of trespassing range. "You think this changes anything?" she hissed. "It doesn't. I run this HOA. And you're a problem. And I eliminate problems." I didn't react. Not externally, but inside. There it was. The line I needed. The confirmation. The exact type of language my lawyer had told me to record. I didn't even have to touch my phone. My security system caught the whole thing. "I'm done talking, Karen," I said. "And you should be too." She stormed off, but I could see it in her shoulders. She wasn't walking away because she wanted to. She was walking away because, for the first time, someone else had seen through her. That afternoon, I expected things to calm down. They didn't. Each board member received a mass email from Karen accusing me of coordinated harassment. And she CC'd half the neighborhood. She demanded emergency fines, emergency hearings, emergency action. She used the word emergency like she was trying to start a wildfire. But here's where it got interesting. 2 board members replied, all to the entire group, and they weren't on her side. One wrote, "Karen, this is getting out of hand. We've seen the footage she shared. We're not issuing anything without further review." The second, "This is not how the HOA is supposed to operate. You're abusing protocol." That was new. That was the first crack in Karen's armor. The first visible sign that people were starting to question her leadership. And once one person questions, it spreads. Rumors started shifting. Not in my direction, but in hers. Neighbors whispered. Some even approached me discreetly to apologize for staying quiet before. But the real moment, the one that changed the entire momentum, came that evening. Around 7 p.m., the board vice president rang my doorbell. He looked tired. Really tired. "We need to talk," he said softly. "Off the record." I invited him in. He sat down at my dining table, took a deep breath, and looked me in the eyes like he was carrying a weight he had held for far too long. "I didn't want to get involved," he said. "But Karen, she's been hiding things. Misusing authority. Ignoring procedure. Intimidating board members. She's been doing it for years." I stayed quiet. Let him continue. "But now she's dragging the whole board into it. Using us to attack you. And it's enough. It's too much. People are starting to talk about removing her." My heart almost stopped. Remove her. He nodded again, slower this time. "But we need evidence. Real evidence. Not rumors. Not suspicion. Something concrete." I didn't even blink. "I have it," I said. He stared at me. "You do." I turned and pointed to the binder sitting neatly on my kitchen counter. "Not just that," I added. "There's more." His shoulders dropped with relief. And that's when he said something I didn't expect. "Good. Because tomorrow? We're calling a meeting without her." My breath caught. A meeting, without Karen. A meeting to expose her. A meeting that could change the entire power structure of the neighborhood. A meeting that could end her reign. I sat back in my chair, letting it sink in. For the first time since moving there, I didn't feel alone. For the first time, Karen wasn't untouchable. For the first time, I knew the storm wasn't coming for me anymore. It was coming for her. The next morning, I felt a mix of excitement and nerves unlike anything I had experienced in weeks. I kept telling myself, stay calm, be professional, stick to the facts. That was the key. This wasn't about revenge in a childish sense. This was about exposing the truth and holding someone accountable. The board meeting was scheduled at the community center. I arrived early, binder in hand, laptop ready, and all my documentation neatly organized. When I walked in, I saw some familiar faces, neighbors who had quietly supported me, some who had previously stayed silent, and a few board members who had clearly been questioning Karen for a while. But Karen wasn't there. Not yet. And I could tell from the nervous energy in the room that something was already shifting. The board vice president greeted me, his expression a mix of relief and tension. "Everything you have, is it all here?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I said, placing the binder on the table. "Every fine, every email, every photo, every recording. It's all here. Chronologically. You can verify everything." The meeting began. The chair opened with formalities, then asked me to present. I took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline spike. "Over the past several months," I began, "I have been the target of repeated fines and harassment from the HOA president, Karen. These fines have been arbitrary, selective, and in many cases, entirely fabricated. I have documented every incident. Today, I want to share this documentation to show the pattern of abuse and why it has become a problem not just for me, but for the integrity of the HOA. I flipped through the binder slowly, projecting confidence and calm. I showed emails, photos of my yard before fines, copies of the HOA handbook rules, and recordings where Karen clearly admitted she decides the rules herself. Each piece was concise, factual, and undeniable. As I presented, the room was quiet. Board members murmured quietly among themselves. Some neighbors shifted in their seats. I could feel the tension building, like everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Then came the part one had been waiting for, showing the inconsistencies. I compared fines issued to me with fines issued to other neighbors. Some of Karen's so-called violations didn't exist in the rulebook at all. Others were ignored when applied to her friends. Patterns emerged on the screen as I presented: favoritism, bias, intimidation. By the time I reached the recordings of her own words, where she admitted she made rules up and targeted me personally, the room was tense. Board members whispered in disbelief. I watched Karen's name go from whispered comments to open gasps and worried looks. And then, Karen stormed in. She was red-faced, furious, and demanding to know why she wasn't informed sooner. She tried to interrupt, to shout over me, to reclaim control. I stayed calm. I didn't raise my voice. I simply said, "Karen, everything I am presenting is documented. This isn't a personal attack, it's evidence of actions that violate the principles of this HOA, and frankly, the trust of the community." For a moment, she faltered. She looked around the room. For the first time, she wasn't in charge. The board members were looking at her differently, curious, cautious, and skeptical. She tried again, her voice sharp and cutting. "This is outrageous. I've been following my duties as president. You're misrepresenting the facts." I responded calmly, "Here are the facts." And I flipped to the email where she wrote, "That doesn't matter. I decide the rules." The room went silent. Every board member could see it. Every neighbor could hear it. Every word was undeniable. Karen sputtered, trying to argue, but she had no ground. Every attempt she made was countered with documented proof. Emails, photos, recordings, witness statements. Everything lined up perfectly. By the end of my presentation, the atmosphere had completely shifted. The board members huddled quietly, whispered among themselves, and then the chair stood up. "Based on the evidence presented," he said, "we are recommending immediate disciplinary action. This includes removal from the HOA president position, a full review of fines issued under her tenure, and reimbursement for any homeowners who were unfairly fined." Karen's face went pale. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. She tried to protest, but no one was listening. She had lost control, and the reality of her actions had finally caught up with her. Neighbors clapped quietly. Some nodded in relief. Others whispered about how brave it was for me to come forward. And for the first time since moving in, I felt free. But it wasn't just about freedom. It was about justice. Karen had abused her position for months, maybe years. She had made people afraid in their own homes. And now, Her power had evaporated in front of the very community she had tried to control. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me. Mrs. Harlan shook my hand, tears in her eyes. "You don't know how much this means," she said. "We've all been scared of her. We thought nobody could stop her." I smiled, exhausted but satisfied. We just needed the truth out in the open. That's all. Lucas, the neighbor whose story had first encouraged me to document everything, clapped me on the shoulder. "You did it. You actually did it." And in that moment, I realized the true impact. This wasn't just my fight. It was the fight of anyone who had been silenced, bullied, or fined unfairly. I hadn't just defended myself. I had protected the community. Karen never apologized. She never admitted wrongdoing. But that didn't matter. Her reputation was gone. Her influence was gone. And the HOA now had a system in place to prevent someone from ever doing what she did again. Weeks later, the board sent out a community notice. All fines issued over the past year would be reviewed, and homeowners who had been unfairly fined would be reimbursed. Karen was removed from her position. A new president was elected, a fair, transparent person who actually cared about the community. I walked through my neighborhood one afternoon, feeling a lightness I hadn't felt in months. The mailboxes were fine. The lawns were just lawns. No one was judging me. No one was harassing me. And most importantly, the fear that had been hanging over my home for so long was gone. Looking back, I realized this story wasn't just about revenge. It was about standing up for yourself, using evidence, patience, and strategy to fight unfairness. It was about taking back power in a situation that feels impossible. And yes, the revenge part was satisfying. Watching someone who had abused power for so long finally face accountability was exhilarating. But the real victory wasn't personal. It was justice. Sometimes in life, you don't need to scream. You don't need to yell or lash out. You just need to be smart, persistent, and unafraid to show the truth. Karen is gone from power. The fines have been reversed. And my home, my peaceful, quiet, happy home? It's finally mine again. I tell the story not because I want revenge for the sake of it, but because I want anyone dealing with an unfair system to know this. You can fight back. You can stand up. And you can win. It just takes courage, patience, and a little bit of strategy. And sometimes, it takes collecting the evidence no one else dared to.